The ICU at Southlake Regional smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, and my brother didn't realize I was awake. I'd been drifting in and out for what I later learned was 32 hours. A patch of black ice on the 400 northbound, my car sliding sideways into the median at 110 kilometers an hour, a subdural haematoma the trauma surgeon had described as significant but not immediately fatal. I came back to consciousness gradually, first the mechanical rhythm of the monitors, then the cannula taped under my nose, then my brother Reid's voice, carrying through the thin curtain dividing my bay from the family consultation area just outside. The trust structure is clear, he said, low and deliberate. If she remains incapacitated and can't appoint a substitute decision-maker in writing, authority defaults to next of kin. That's me. His wife Amber's voice came back quieter. And the Muskoka property? Part of the trust assets. If I control the trust, I control the property. We list it by July, move before the market softens. I lay very still. My head felt like something had been poured into it and left to harden, but I kept my breathing measured, my eyes closed, every muscle deliberately slack. 20 years of early mornings, 14-hour accounting seasons, and the discipline my father had drilled into me from the time I was old enough to carry a toolbox, stay composed exactly when you want to react most, kept me exactly where I was. Reid continued. She's always been the responsible one, the good daughter. Well, she can't run anything from a hospital bed. The curtain rustled, a nurse's shoes squeaked past, and I lay there memorizing every syllable. My father, Walter Drummond, built his contracting company with a second-hand pickup truck and a reputation for never cutting corners. He'd come down from Cape Breton at 23, settled in Barrie, and spent the next 4 decades constructing homes, schools, and eventually commercial buildings across central Ontario. By the time he died of a heart attack 3 winters ago, Drummond Construction had contracts across 3 provinces and a property trust worth more than I was ever comfortable discussing at other people's dinner parties. He left Reid and me equal shares in memory. He left me the keys. The trust document was 47 pages long, reviewed by 2 independent lawyers, and structured by a Bay Street firm my father had retained specifically because he didn't trust firms that knew our neighbors. He'd told me why, once, sitting on the dock at the cottage in Muskoka the summer before he got sick. He'd looked out at the water for a long time before speaking. Your brother is a good person, Waverly. But good people can want the wrong things when there's money in the room. I hadn't wanted to believe him then. I believed him now. The cottage was the thing Reid had always resented most. Dad had built it himself, board by board, over 4 summers in the early 90s. 3 bedrooms, a screen porch that sagged slightly on the left side, a dock he repaired every May, with the same cedar planks from the same mill in Gravenhurst. He'd taken Reid and me up there every Labor Day weekend for as long as I could remember. But it was me he'd taught to operate the old flat-bottomed aluminum boat, me he'd trusted to winterize the pipes each November, and me who'd sat with him on that dock in the dark when he first told me about the cancer scare that turned out not to be cancer, but had frightened him badly enough to put his affairs in order. That cottage was not real estate. It was the only place I still felt like his daughter instead of a CPA managing a dead man's legacy. Reid had wanted to sell it since the week of the funeral. My father had known that, which was precisely why the trust made it impossible without my written consent, until now, if I couldn't give consent. When the nursing shift changed at 7 in the morning, I waited until the new nurse had done her checks and stepped out to the station, and then I reached for the call button and pressed it twice, firmly. When she returned, I looked at her directly and spoke through the fog of the painkillers. I need a phone, and I need you to know that I've been fully conscious for several hours. She blinked, then she called the attending. The resident who came seemed startled by how coherent I was. I answered everything he put to me, backwards counting the date, the Prime Minister, my own postal code. He made notes. He said they'd reassess. I thanked him and asked again for a phone. The number I called was one I'd memorized before I ever owned a cell phone, because my father had made me memorize it the same way he'd made me learn our home address as a child. Victor Petrenko had maintained the Drummond properties for 23 years. He'd been a civil engineer in Kyiv before he immigrated to Canada. My father hired him initially to renovate the Barrie office building and never let him leave. Victor had lived in a small house on the adjacent lot to the cottage property for the last 12 years. He'd held an umbrella over my father's casket in the rain because Reid had ducked into the funeral home the moment the sky opened. He picked up on the second ring. When I told him where I was and what I'd heard, the line went quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in his careful accented English, "You are going to be okay." "I need you to contact Isabelle Cote," I said. Isabelle was the trust lawyer who had handled my father's estate, a precise, formidable woman who had clerked at the Ontario Court of Justice and had absolutely no patience for people who misread their own legal position. Tell her what's happening, tell her I need an emergency video call, and tell her to look at the substitute decision-maker clause on page 31 of the trust document. Victor said nothing about compensation. He didn't ask what was in it for him. He said, "I will call her in 10 minutes," and hung up. I adjusted my pillow, lay back, and let the steady beeping of the monitors fill the room while I worked through the options the way my father had always approached a problem, methodically, without panic, starting from what was true. What was true? I was alive, more coherent than anyone in this hospital had realized, and in legal possession of every significant asset Reid thought he was about to inherit. What was also true, he had, at most, 72 hours before the attending physician's updated assessment would change the narrative entirely. That gave me exactly the window I needed. Reid arrived the next morning, carrying a coffee from Tim Hortons and wearing the particular expression he always wore when he was trying to look casual and wasn't quite managing it. Amber stood in the doorway and scanned the room the way someone does when they're already measuring for new furniture. He sat down, set the coffee on the tray table without asking if I wanted it, and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. "The hospital's legal coordinator put me in touch with an estate and incapacity specialist," he said, with the rehearsed naturalness of a sentence practiced in front of a bathroom mirror. "Just routine. While you're recovering." He slid a sheaf of papers onto the tray table beside the untouched coffee. "It's just a temporary administrative authority document, so someone can handle things, the property hydro bills, the trust remittances, while you're not able to." "Reid!" He stopped. "I heard you and Amber talking on Thursday night." The color left his face with an almost physical completeness, like someone had turned off a tap. I watched him for a moment, then I said, "I'd like you to take those papers off my tray table." He didn't move. Amber made a small sound from the doorway. I picked up the call button and held it visibly. "I am going to press this in approximately 10 seconds if those papers are still on my tray table. The nursing staff knows I'm fully alert and oriented. There will be a record of every person who has brought documents into this room." He took the papers. He said nothing. Amber said, "She's not thinking clearly," to the middle distance. I looked at her steadily. The trust attorney was granted emergency remote signing authority as of 6:30 this morning. The substitute decision-maker designation now reads Isabelle Cote. You're welcome to verify that with your own lawyer. They left. I pressed the call button anyway, not because I needed anything, but because I wanted the timestamp on record. Over the next 4 days, I faked it carefully. I let the attending physician describe my prognosis to Reid in terms that were clinically accurate, but that Reid chose to interpret as more dire than they were. I let Amber circulate a message through the extended family that I was not improving as hoped. I let Reid accept a casserole from my aunt without correcting his implication that he was managing things. I lay in that adjustable hospital bed and breathed slowly, and watched through half-closed eyes while Victor moved documents in and out inside the battered canvas bag he used for property inspection reports, and I signed everything Isabelle needed with my left hand after visiting hours on video call. Victor photographed every paper Reid left at the nursing station. He noted every phone call Reid made from the hospital lobby, visible through the window he passed each day. He brought me information the way my father had always operated, quietly, thoroughly, without drama. One evening, sitting in the chair beside my bed with his large work-roughened hands folded in his lap, Victor told me that Reid had brought a man to the Cottage property the previous October, while I was on a contract audit in Calgary. The man had walked the perimeter with Reid and left a business card on the dock that Victor had photographed, a real estate appraiser from a Bracebridge brokerage. I closed my eyes. I breathed for a moment. Then I said, "Can you put that in writing?" He said he already had. What happened next is the part my extended family will probably discuss for the rest of their lives, and I don't mind that at all. Reid had organized a gathering at the hospital, 20-odd people, filling the family lounge on the 3rd floor, including my father's business partners, 2 of my aunts, my mother's closest friend from her church in Angus, and several of Drummond Construction's longtime employees. He'd framed it in his group message as a chance to be together as a family while Waverly is still with us. He'd arranged food on 2 long tables, a gesture that would have been touching under any other circumstances. I had been out of the ICU for 36 hours by then. My attending physician had formally documented my cognitive recovery as complete. I had showered without assistance, reviewed 40 pages of trust amendments, and slept. I had eaten a bowl of oatmeal that tasted like paper and chosen to wear, not a hospital gown, but the clean blazer and slacks Victor had quietly retrieved from my apartment on Bayfield Street. I walked into the family lounge 17 minutes into Reid's remarks. He was mid-sentence when the door opened and people turned to look, and his voice simply stopped. My aunt made a sound that wasn't quite a word. One of my father's employees, a retired site foreman named Bert who had worked for Drummond Construction for 31 years, took one look at me and started to smile. I walked to the center of the room, set my phone on the table, and pressed play. Reid's voice came through the small speaker with perfect clarity into the sudden silence. The trust defaults to me if she doesn't sign. That's me. We list the Muskoka property by July. Then Amber's voice. And the cottage is ours. The room sat with it for a long moment. I stopped the recording. I looked at Reid. He said, "That's out of context." Bert said from the back of the room with quiet disgust, "No, it isn't." Reid tried again. He said I clearly hadn't been well, that stress and grief did strange things to families, that this wasn't the time or place for this kind of confrontation. Amber stood beside him and said nothing, staring at the tablecloth. My father's oldest business partner, a man in his 70s who had shaken hands on a partnership with my father over 30 years ago, set down his paper cup of coffee and walked out without a word. Two of my aunts followed him. I placed the trust amendment documents on the table beside my phone. The Drummond family trust has been restructured, I said. The Muskoka property is no longer a liquid asset. It's been placed into a conservation easement with the Muskoka Heritage Foundation. It cannot be listed, subdivided, or commercially developed. My father built that dock with his own hands. No one is listing it by July. Reid's jaw worked. You can't just. I already did. Isabel filed the amended documents with the County Land Registry office on Tuesday morning. You're welcome to call her. He didn't call. He grabbed his coat and left, Amber's heels clicking behind him on the linoleum, and the door wheezed shut on its pneumatic arm. Bert walked over and shook my hand in both of his, the way he had at my father's funeral. He said, Walter would have stood up and clapped. I laughed for the first time in a week. It hurt my head, but only a little. Reid retained a lawyer, of course. He contested the trust amendment on grounds that I'd been under medication and undue influence at the time of signing. The case moved through the Ontario Superior Court at the particular pace that family trust litigation always moves, slowly and expensively. His legal team submitted affidavits from people who had observed me being emotionally unstable at various points, a characterization that would have made my father laugh until he cried, given that his primary complaint about me for most of my adult life was that I was too steady, too reluctant to show what I was actually feeling. Isabel appeared in court with time-stamped clinical assessments from 3 separate Southlake Regional physicians confirming my full cognitive capacity during the relevant period. She appeared with Victor's written account of the October Cottage visit and the photographed brokerage card. She appeared with the audio recording, properly authenticated, and with nursing station access logs showing the exact moment Reid's documents had arrived at my bedside. The judge dismissed the contest entirely. I sat at the counsel table and watched my brother sign the acknowledgement of the amended trust, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph exactly, but the sensation of setting down something very heavy you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten what it weighed. He looked at me across the aisle as we stood to leave. I looked back. There was nothing left that hadn't already been said in a hospital room, and I turned and walked out of the courthouse into a March afternoon in Barrie that smelled like the last of the snow was finally thinking about leaving. I haven't spoken to Reid since. 2 weeks after the ruling, I drove up to the cottage on a Friday evening. The highway was finally clear, the sky going pale pink over the tree line north of Gravenhurst. Victor's truck was already in the driveway. He'd opened the place up, run the water, checked the dock boards for winter heaving. He'd stacked firewood beside the side door the way he always had. I sat down across from him at the kitchen table, the same pine table my father had bought at an estate sale in Huntsville 25 years ago, and I slid an envelope across the wood toward him. Inside was a letter from the trust confirming a lifetime property easement on the adjacent lot he'd been renting, converted to freehold title in his name, full ownership, no rent, a pension supplement structured through the Drummond Trust so that he and his wife would not have to worry about money for the rest of their lives. He opened the envelope, he read the letter twice. Then he looked up, and for a moment he looked exactly the way he had at my father's graveside, like a man holding something almost too large for his face to contain. He said very carefully, Walter always said you were the one. I nodded. I couldn't quite speak for a second. He folded the letter back into the envelope with the deliberate precision of someone treating a document worth protecting, which it was. We sat for a while without talking. Outside, the lake was still, and the birch trees along the water were just beginning to show the faintest pale green of new buds. My father had built this place because he wanted something real, he used to say. Something you could touch, where the work showed in the wood. He'd taught me to bail out the old aluminum boat on that dock, to read the weather coming across the water, to measure twice and cut once, and not just with lumber. I stayed for the whole weekend. I slept better than I had in months. On Sunday morning, I made coffee and took it out to the dock, and sat there in my jacket while the mist was still on the water. And I thought about what it costs to build something meant to last, and what it costs when the people who were supposed to protect it never once understood its value. The dock boards were solid under my feet, the lake was quiet, and everything my father had trusted me with was exactly where he had always meant it to be.